Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I am going to be doing my power rankings, the first of two parts to the power rankings for the Overwatch League postseason for 2022. This is really the final big set of videos for the 2022 season. And so this is where we talk about how I have my final rankings for this season. All 20 teams, one ranking. I'm going to break this up into two videos as I normally do. So today we're going to go through teams 20 through 11, the bottom 10. And then on Monday, I'll have my video going over 10 to 1, my top 10. So be on the lookout for that. Obviously, 12 teams make the playoffs. So a couple of playoff teams, at the very least, will be in this video. So if you are excited for that and love power rankings, this is the video for you. I just want to throw out there my kind of caveat I do for all my power rankings. Of course, these are my power rankings. I may have different metrics that I use to judge teams than other people do. A lot of this is going to take the playoffs heavily, but not entirely based on playoff performance. I don't look at numbers. I don't really care where you finish in the playoffs as much as I care about your games, the quality of your play, quality of your opponents, stuff like that. Those are the types of things I care a lot about. But this video is going to be a lot of the non-playoff teams. So with that in mind, let's jump in and talk about it. Obviously, that will be more impacting part one. This time around, we're going to talk about the majority of teams in this video will be ones that did not make the playoffs. So yeah, let's go and let's talk about where I am kicking off this list. At number 20, I think this one is not a surprise to anybody. I have the Paris Eternal. They finished with the worst record in the league. They finished 1-23, minus 56 map differential. Their map win rate this season was 1.7, which is the third worst in Overwatch League history, behind only the 2021 Valiant and the 2018 Shanghai Dragons, who of course didn't win a single game. This Eternal team did not have a good year. They struggled the entire season. They were bottom feeders for the entirety of 2022. Major roster move that they made during the season, but this was not their year in any way, shape, or form. They struggled a lot this past year, and I think no surprise to anybody here that they are here at the bottom. Curious to see what direction they take this roster going forward and whether or not they go for big swings or if they keep a lot of the roster and the core pieces and just kind of do a little bit here and there. But this team did not have a good year in 2022, and so I think no surprise to anybody, they are at the bottom here at number 20. Coming in at number 19, I have the New York Excelsior. They finished with the second worst record in the league at 4-20, minus 38 differential. They just never really got things together this season, despite the fact that they had some very, very, very big name players on this roster going into the season, like Yaki and Gangnamjin and Flora. They just never really looked quite good. Their roster construction was a little questionable throughout the season. They never really had a solid support core. It was constantly in and out. They had three different flex support players at some point, as well as a lackluster DPS flexibility with only Flora and Yaki. Ansun J playing on ping. It was a very, very weird roster this year. So I don't fully blame it on the players on the roster. I do think a lot of it comes down to just the fact that this roster just wasn't built well. And there's always been stuff we've talked about here, but there was still talent in this roster, and the fact that they did as poorly as they did says a lot of bad things as well when you consider there's rosters like Houston and San Francisco who had very good years, who had somewhat similar roster situations than this team. This team just did not put it together. They did not look very good. I expect a full rebuild going into 2023, but in terms of their 2022 performance, New York, to me, very clearly 19 on this list. At number 18, I have the Vancouver Titans. Despite a very nice bounce back in the second half of the season after a very rough winless start to the season. New head coach Deepe comes in and the team starts to look a lot better. It was not enough, in my opinion, to put this team outside of the bottom 3. They still struggled quite a bit throughout the season. Even when they looked like they could have potentially been getting better, things didn't really go their way. And if you really think about it, Vancouver had a really good set of wins against New York and Paris, right? They're a team that on the season won 5 games. I believe 2 of those were Paris and 1 of those was New York. And so outside of those 2 teams, they only beat 2 other teams in the league. I believe 1 was Toronto and 1 was Washington. So if you look at really what they did on the season, wins-wise, it wasn't really that impressive. They got their act together late in the season to be good enough to get some wins. But I still think their season was pretty lackluster. And when you consider the overall performance out of them this season, yeah, I think it's pretty clear that they are the 18th best team from the 2022 season. They had some talent, they had some moments, but ultimately they were not better than a bottom 3 finish. While I think those last 3 spots were pretty obvious no-brainers, to me, this is where the list starts to get a little bit more tight and a little bit more contentious. But at 17, I have the Los Angeles Valiant. I thought about putting them up one more spot, but I think that ultimately their performance this season was not good enough, in my opinion, for me to jump them above the person ahead of them. The Valiant were the weakest team in the APAC region this season. Much improved from their absolutely bottom-feeding performance in 2021. Much better roster this year, much better players, but they just could not get it together. I think that they had moments, but really it was a type of thing where they were good enough to win against some of the teams around them, but they were never good enough to do it consistently, and they were never good enough to show that they really should be a higher-level team. And so at the end of the day, they were good at times, but they just did not have the pizzazz, if you will, the oomph, if you will, to really kind of go that extra mile. They had a lot of games that went to 5 that they lost. They had a lot of close series that they just couldn't finish in those matches. And that is a huge problem for a team like the Valiant. To me, one of the signs of a good team is if you get pushed to 5, can you win that match consistently? Teams like the San Francisco Shock this year were really, really good map 5 teams where they rarely lost in map 5s. Every so often, of course, they did, but more often than not, they won those map 5s. Historically, those are the teams that do better in the league, and I think that is a sign of somewhat negative things for this Valiant roster, that they just could never really get over the finish line. They could get you close, they could get you close to the edge, but they could never push you, and that, to me, was one of the things that really let them solidify here and not at any spot higher. At number 16, I have the Boston Uprising. Maybe a little bit controversial. I think some people may argue that the Uprising could be higher on this list, but the more I thought about this team and their run, I kind of view them as a, kind of a bottom team in the Western region that just got lucky that there were 3 teams that were just worse than they were. They were a 10-win team this season, which is pretty respectable, but keep in mind, 6 of those wins came between the Paris Eternal, the New York Excelsior, and the Vancouver Titans, all whom of which they played twice. Outside of that, they had some okay wins, getting wins over teams like Florida and Houston. I think they beat Washington, and maybe London was another win. I don't remember exactly who their 4th win was. But they were never really able to beat the best teams in the world. Oh, they beat Atlanta. Not that's what it was. They beat Atlanta, not London. So a lot of teams they beat were okay teams, or at times great teams, but usually when they played them, it was when those teams were not playing at their best, and Boston was never able to continue those results down the stretch. And I think, to me, really the big sticking point is that when you consider where this team got a lot of their wins, I think we look at an Uprising team that was good enough to stay afloat and good enough to keep the bottom level teams down, but consistently not good enough to really find success against those teams ahead of them. That's a huge sticking point to me, something that I think really hurts this Uprising roster and what their 2022 campaign was. There was a ton of turnover in terms of players and coaches. It was kind of a mess to watch, and so I think that this is really the best spot for them, because I think that they just never really had those moments of inspiration that you had with some of the teams ahead of them. And so to me, they're right at home here in the 16 spot. In the 15 spot, I have the Guangzhou Charge, a team that had one of the best second halves of any team this year, going 8-4 in the second half of the season after a 1-11 start to the season. So their second half of the season, very, very good. They made major roster moves, and they looked like a team that could potentially fight for a spot in the playoffs, get through the play-ins, and be a potential threat in the postseason. But that didn't happen. They fell short in the play-ins, losing to the Chengdu Hunters. And I think a lot of it came down to the fact that they had good players on this roster, but they just could not play Winston. They could not play the main tank role, and that hurt them in those final hours of this team's life. But I still loved a lot of what they did. I think of all the teams that I'm going to talk about in this video, they had the most impressive highs of the ones that didn't make the playoffs. I think that they're really the one who really impressed me the most. I absolutely thought they were a shoo-in to make the playoffs. I think a lot of us were surprised when they fell short. But I love what this team did in the second half of the season. I think that they have a really good foundation to build upon for next season. But looking back at this season, their slow start to the year, their major changes just did not do enough to get them where they needed to be to make it into the playoffs. And so they are here in the 15 spot. Coming in at number 14, just ever so slightly ahead of the Guangzhou Charge, I have the Chengdu Hunters. Hunters came very, very, very close in that Guangzhou Charge series in the play-ins to getting 3-0'd, but they reverse swept off the backs of Gaga and his incredible Winston play, and it was a very good performance from them, but they could not get over the barrier that was the Hangzhou Spark. And so to me, the Chengdu Hunters are one of those teams where they had a lot of potential going into this year when you consider what they did last year. They were one of the most consistent teams in 2021. They made all three of the major tournaments. They made the playoffs. They did well in almost all of those tournaments, but going into this season, they made changes. They made roster moves. A lot of people expected them to have more players than they did. Then they got rid of a bunch of them. They had a tough and awkward season, to be perfectly honest, and so I think that is really where their lower levels are. But with a player like Leave on your roster and Gaga, who I thought has been very, very consistently strong for this team, and a pretty solid support line, I thought that they had an overall very successful season, and I think that they were one of the top teams kind of outside of that playoff bubble that really did kind of have their moments. They were able to beat some of those better teams consistently, more consistently than the likes of the Valiant and the Charge, or even teams like the Uprising in the Western region. So to me, this is a very good spot for them. I thought they had a pretty good run, just wasn't good enough, and so they are here at number 14. That, of course, leaves the 13 team who did not make the playoffs, the final team that missed out on the playoffs, that is the Washington Justice. I was very impressed by what the Justice were able to do late in the season after they made major changes to their roster. I think a lot of people expected the Justice to be worse after Mag, Happy, and Vigilante's departures from this team. But I actually felt like the Justice had a very solid outing after that moment. I thought that the team looked much more solidified. They looked more together. They looked more like they kind of knew what they were at this point in time. And I thought it was a decent run from them. Yes, they missed out on playoffs, and they did have the weakest performance in the Western region play-ins, losing to both Toronto and Boston. However, I think overall their season was better than that of Boston and better than that of Chengdu. Justice made 2 out of the 3 tournaments this year, or I guess 2 out of the 4, if you want to count the playoffs. They made the Kickoff Clash, and they made the Summer Showdown. Chengdu didn't make any tournaments. Boston didn't make any tournaments. Charge and Vancouver only made 1 tournament. Justice were more consistent than that. I thought that they had really high highs, but they were just not able to hit those consistently due to a number of different factors with the way their roster kind of played, and I think there were definitely some issues beyond the players' control that led to this team not having the success that I think a lot of us would have anticipated from them, but unfortunately they were not able to meet it. Regardless, I think that they were the best team that didn't make it into the playoffs as a whole. Definitely one that's up and down. A lot of people thought they were going to make it into the playoffs, but they just did not manage to get it done at the end. but they're still a very solid team. They're still a strong team. I still like a lot of what we've seen out of the Justice. And so despite the fact that they are here outside of the top 12, I do think that they were the best of the rest when it comes to the 2022 season. Moving on to number 12, the first of the playoff teams in this list, I have the Philadelphia Fusion. I just was not impressed by what the Fusion did at the end of the season. I thought they had a very solid season throughout. It was relatively inconsistent, but when they hit their peaks, they were able to beat the Seoul Dynasty, the Shanghai Dragons. They beat the Dallas Fuel. They beat a lot of very good teams in the 2022 season, and they were able to do it in somewhat convincing fashion multiple times. But at the end of the season, they just did not have that flair. They did not have that next gear that we had kind of seen from them at times throughout the season. I don't think the meta was particularly favored for them. I think that they just started to struggle. Obviously, the issue with Zest and his hand, that had obviously had some type of impact on them. The Fusion are a team that I don't think a lot of people had incredibly high expectations for. I think people expect them to be okay throughout the tournament. I think people thought they would be able to do at least something here and there. And they did. They were able to do enough at times to get some success throughout and do very, very well in the Kickoff Clash and the Midseason Madness, but the second half of the season for them just did not go nearly as well as the first half. They managed to make playoffs, but they did not really look like the team we had expected from them. And so to me, they were the most disappointing of the 12 teams in the playoffs. And so they are my 12 team in my power rankings. Finally, at number 11, I have the Toronto Defiant. This team had a lot of moments throughout the season that were pretty decent. Obviously, the Summer Showdown when they finished third in front of the Toronto crowd. They made it through the play-ins and managed to make it into the playoffs. But overall, their season was very, very average. They finished with a very respectable average 12-12 roster, -1 differential, about as middling as you can get as a team. And they didn't have any real life in the playoffs. They got swept by the Houston Outlaws and then lost a close series to the Hangzhou Spark. This Defiant roster had their moments at times throughout the year, but I don't think they were able to show us anything really, really good because I think they had some limitations in the way their roster was constructed. Obviously, they lost their head coach during the season, so that has an impact on your team as well. Maybe sometimes more than what people would like to admit, though sometimes losing a coach does have a positive effect on a team depending on what the environment was. Regardless, I think that this Defiant team just was not able to live up to some of the expectations that people had of them based on what their roster was. And despite the shine at times, they're a pretty middling roster, a very, very average roster in the Overwatch League, which means an 11 finish is pretty close to where this team would have been in the kind of overall image of what the Defiant season was and the overall season as a whole. They were a middling team. They have a middling spot. They are here in the 11th spot. So that is it for part 1 of my 2022 postseason power rankings. There are still 10 more teams to talk about, but we will be talking about them on Monday. So if you enjoyed this video and want to make sure you get that second part, make sure you subscribe and like the video. Helps the channel out a bunch, and that is one of the best ways that you will be able to know when it goes live. But that is all for me for this video. Comment down below your thoughts on anything I talked about. If you agree with my placements, disagree with my placements, whatever it might be, let me know in the comments. But that is all. Thank you all once again. Your support is greatly, greatly appreciated, and very, very excited as we move into the 2023 season and off season to see where things go from here. But that's all. I hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye bye.